Welcome to New York University. My name is Stefano Albertini. I'm the director of Casa Italiana. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for this other installment of Hidden Gems. And it's a series that Antonio Monda created as a part of his festival called Le Conversazioni, The Conversations. That is a festival now that branches out in very fancy parts of the world, starting with Capri. That's where the festival was born, with a series of conversations with writers of different nationalities, especially Americans, of course, given the fact that Antonio lives here. So we are very delighted that this formula is working. And Antonio invites every time a guest, could be a writer, a director, an actor, to talk about 3 films each in which they believe have not received the attention that they should have received, or they deserve an extra viewing on our part. And I've discovered many things I was completely unaware of during this series, and it's a very exciting moment. You don't need to worry about taking notes about these films because we do not publicize them before, but the very moment the evening ends, they're going to be on our website so you can check them out and have the titles and all the references. So tonight Antonio is here with Joshua Cohen, who is a writer. His last book, The Netanyahus, won a Pulitzer Prize. Joshua also teaches both translation and creative writing at Columbia and Yale. And Antonio Monda, I should not introduce him because he's on this stage more than I am, but just I want to remind you his latest book, Incontri ravvicinati, Close Encounters. It's about 300 pages in which Antonio... 700. Did I receive a reduced edition? 700 pages in which Antonio goes through the many people that he has encountered, especially since he arrived in New York some 30 years ago. 31. So the New York Times called Antonio like a living cultural institution, and that's what he is. But tonight, he and Josh are going to talk about cinema and about the films that deserve our second look or brand new look. Please welcome Joshua Cohen and Antonio Monda.
Benvenuti, welcome to the Conversazioni. Thank you, Josh. Before starting our event, I would like to pay homage to a great artist who passed away a few weeks ago. I think with the possible exception of Federico Fellini, he's been the director that created the most powerful and poetic dreams, if not nightmares, at the cinema. Let's watch the first clip and then we start our conversation. And what I want to say, and when I say to David Lynch is exactly what he just said. In dreams, I walk with you. Thank you, David. So, you know the format. We have a rich program. I would start from Joshua's first choice. You want to say something, or we first watch the clip?
I think I should just start by saying thank you, people who are coming, especially people who are standing. That seems intense. And I should also apologize. I know nothing about Italian or film.
I don't believe you.
Well, we're just going to go. Let's do it.
We just spoke about Bassani, Calvino, and Buzzati. So
None of those are filmmakers.
True.
Yeah. Yes.
So, sure. Why don't we start with the first clip? This is Joshua's first choice. So, why did you pick the Dybbuk?
Oh, wow. I don't know. I think that a feeling of an inability to explain to myself what my experience of reality is, and so being able to default into this sense of being haunted by demons of the past and generational trauma, and which I guess is the trendy phrase for a demon that enters through your mouth, anus, or ears and takes control of you. The Dybbuk is this story. I'll do it. It's based on the Waszynski play, which he wrote right before the Bolshevik Revolution, and wrote it in Yiddish, and he never saw it performed in his life. It went on to become a very successful play, but in Poland, and this film was made in 1937, which is the real beginning of the liquidation of Yiddish under Stalin. The closing of Yiddish schools, Yiddish theaters, the murder of Yiddish poets. And this is done in Poland. However, by a combination of two major Yiddish troops. The story, which I'm going to really abridge, is two people, Hanan and Leah, are promised to each other by their parents that they would marry each other. Then, because people die, that match gets undone. And then Hanan, the bridegroom who is promised to this bride, later he shows up in this town, kind of not knowing that they were intended to be together by their parents' agreement, and falls in love with her. She, however, is promised to marry some, obnoxious rich guy, which is an early movie trope that is eternal. And so he begins studying mysticism, Kabbalah, in order to find a way to seduce her or to just change his world. And then, failing all of that, he summons Satan. Satan comes and strikes him dead, at which point his soul, his Dybbuk, he comes and haunts Leah, and she falls in love with his spirit that is haunting her. And it's the idea that she's outwardly acting crazy by the standards of her community, when really she's being haunted by someone who loves her more than anything. That is a dynamic that I feel like I've experienced.
Do you believe in demons?
Yes, I do.
Me too. There is a film by...
Wow, good. We're done.
Yeah. There is a great short film by Federico Fellini, Toby Dammit. My Italian cinema students know it, where the protagonist, played by Terence Stamp, is interviewed. He's an actor. And the interviewer asked him, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "No." "Do you believe in the devil?" "Yes."
No.
And you understand that he's going to die very soon.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the it's interesting, like that scene here, which is it's a good scene to pick. Just you don't need to be able to read any of the Hebrew letters on the gravestones to realize that they're all most of the gravestones have the same date on it. And the date on it is, I think, 1634, 1635. It corresponds to the year of the Chmielnicki pogroms. And so everyone in that cemetery had been killed at the same time. And she is sitting there kind of praying at the grave of a bride and a groom who were killed under the wedding canopy. And then this weird stranger comes and is the kind of voice warning her that she's playing around with odd forces. And what I like about this is that the people, just to respond to what you were talking about, is that the people who are closest to her are the people who are saying, no, there's no such thing as demons. This is all just kind of nonsense. And it's the people who she had always considered the sort of untouchables or unreachables in her town, are the people who are actually telling her the truth that these demons do, in fact, exist.
Let's say something about the director. Michael Waszynski's real name was Moshe
Vox.
Yeah. He moved to Spain and Italy, and he became a producer, quite a famous producer. He was openly homosexual, but he married an Italian countess, and inherited the fortune, and he converted to Catholicism. Do you know other films by Waszynski?
I know films that he worked on. I mean, like El Cid, he worked on El Cid. And
he was the producer of El Cid with Charlton Heston, among others.
But, I will say, so the groom in this, which we didn't see, his name is Leon Liebgold. And the woman we saw, her name she has a great name of Liliana. And they were married, actually. And the outbreak of the Second World War found them on tour. I think they were in France, and they ended up coming here, and they did programs for kids about the Yiddish theater. And when I was 9 or 10 years old, I was brought to a thing. There was like the Arbeiter Ring was doing it, like on 33rd Street, and these two old people that I was told were important, who were not in black and white, were in color, told us about being in Yiddish cinema, which we were like, we didn't know what Yiddish was or cinema, And then she died in Queens, I think, in 92 or 93. The man who played the messenger, his name is the tall guy, or the guy who looks even more tall with all of that Murnau kind of staging, his name was Isaac Samberg, and he was the major player in the Vilna Yiddish troupe, who then put on Yiddish theater in the Warsaw Ghetto and was murdered in 1943 in the Majdanek extermination camp. And this was his kind of biggest turn, telling everyone that the dead come back to haunt us. Yeah.
Let's go to my first choice, which is an American film, a completely different story. Let's watch it. What I like and admire about this film is the perfect fusion and the perfect blend of irony, cruelty, pity, mercy. It's a very difficult film. It's based on a play by Mark Crowley, whose real name was Martino Crowley, was half Italian. And it's about this group of friends, they're all homosexual, who are celebrating the birthday of one of them, the one dressed in green. And after 5 minutes, the situation becomes more and more morbid and more cruel. The director is William Friedkin, who at the time was dating Howard Hawks' daughter. And he was so emotional when he finally met the legendary director, and he showed his film. And he was concerned that it couldn't be successful. And in fact, at the end of the screening, Howard Hawks went to him and he said, "You don't want to do this film if you want to be successful." And in fact, the next film was French Connection. And but besides this little story, I think this is one of the great films about the humanity hidden beyond cruelty and sometimes sarcasm. And the way he directs all the actors, who, by the way, with the exception of Cliff Gorman, they died in 10 years, all of them, of AIDS. It's a terrible story, yeah. And the way he directs the actor is quite masterful. You see how great the director he was, not only in chase sequences or action movies. Did you know the film?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I known the film, but I hadn't seen it in... the one time I had seen it was actually in a film forum, sort of bringing it back, where I felt like very much an interloper because I went to a kind of, I don't know, noon lazy person who doesn't have a job screening, and it turned out that a number of the people who had went to the screening had known people involved with the film, and I realized that I had arrived at what I thought was going to be just me doing something before I actually have to get to work kind of day. And I'd arrived at something fairly, a serious emotional sort of situation. I thought it was, I think it's an amazing film, not just for its politics and the way that it also depicts a certain world, but just also technically being able to be intimate with so many people in that room at once, and certainly privileging the monologue, but not leaving anyone out and giving everyone something to do.
Would it be possible today to make a film like this?
Not for me. I don't know. I mean, I think that one thing, when you sent me that clip and I went back at it, I said, you will never have 6 people in a room where not at least one person is on their phone. And the whole thing is kind of centered around, should I call him or shouldn't I call him? And you would think that, with our phones now, everyone would be calling him, right? I think it would be political as much as a technological challenge.
Okay, let's go now to your second choice, a completely different film directed by Werner Schroeder. Mm-hmm. And it was a huge fiasco. Not artistic fiasco, I'm talking about box office.
Okay.
I want to thank you for this because I didn't know the film. I knew just the title. Werner Schroeder won the Palme d'Or and then an Oscar for The Thin Drum. And this was his chance to do a big international film. But why did you pick it?
Yeah, Volker Schlöndorff. Why did I pick it? Oh, God, I don't know. For every reason. it's one of my favorite books. It's based on
Von Kleist.
Von Kleist from 1808, I think, and I love the combination of the 16th century and hippies. That's answer number 2. Answer number 3 is it's the movie with, to my mind, the greatest cast of writers and weird people in it. The writer Peter Weiss is in it. The writer Gregor von Risori is in it. The rhythm guitarist Keith Richards is in it as a soldier. And I think it's encapsulated actually in that line that it ends with is, why are you running away? We're fighting for you. It's a good January 6th Trump movie. It's a small business owner, as we would call him, who just wants to bring his horses from Brandenburg to Saxony to sell them in the market. And some Junker, a knight, stops him and says, no, you have to pay this tax. And the guy's like, there's no tax. And there's like, no, we elites, we charge a tax. And until you pay it, we're requisitioning your horses. He mistreats the horses' grooms, ends up through a series of things killing Michael Kohlhaas' wife, at which point Kohlhaas declares war on the entire state of Saxony, and gets together a terrorist band and burns the place, and not even Martin Luther can talk him down, and it's this populist rebellion where law and justice are confused.
I must make a correction. I say Werner Schroeder. Of course, it's Volker Schlöndorff completely.
Yeah. Schlöndorff would probably want another guy to direct it because it was a total box office catastrophe. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
All your picks are adaptation from books.
Yeah. I told you I don't know anything about movies. I mean, this is my way of cheating my way through this.
Is it true that you're writing something on von Kleist?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've thought a while about sort of doing a Trumpian, von Kleist kind of takeoff. But no, I think I picked this. I really did pick this movie because, first of all, because I actually think it's a good movie. And there is, it begins with a sequence about the 68 riots in the universities, and that's kind of the sequence that begins the movie. And it's, and I feel that this sort of populism and this misdirected anger at elites and this again confusion of law and justice that ultimately leads Kohlhaas from having the moral high ground to becoming a terrorist is fascinating to me, and I think that and that the way in which he interacts with the ecclesiastical and political power of his time seems very contemporary. And I also have watched it 3 times trying to figure out which one is Keith Richards, which is very important.
When did you see it for the first time?
Well, the only way to see it is on YouTube in like 5 different, that's why the version is so bad. When did I see it for the first time? I think I was interested in, because this was the movie that was supposed to make Schlöndorff sort of internationally, right? And I think it came out, it was called Kohlhaas,
The Rebel.
But then it was released in the United States as Man on Horseback.
Yeah, Man on Horseback.
Which is just, okay. And with this kind of redone electric guitar score. And I was interested in, this was his attempt to really enter an international market, an American market, and somehow draw some connection between the international counterculture with roots in America, the American counterculture, and this deeply medieval text. And these energies, I think, got the best of him. He didn't make a commercial film, but he made a very interesting film.
Thank you. Let's go now to my second choice, which is another disaster at the box office.
Let's do it. Let's hope it doesn't rub off on us.
This was Olmi's farewell to neorealism. The idea of casting Rod Steiger, for example. It's about a young kid who wants to become a priest. And this is a scandal for his family, scandal for his friends. And he will later become a pope, a great pope, John the 23rd, Papa Roncalli. And the film was completely trashed and panned by Italian critics. But to be honest,
What year is it? The movie?
1965. Olmi until the late 70s was an outcast in Italian cinema. Only when he made The Tree with the Wooden Clothes, L'albero degli zoccoli, and won the Palme d'Or in Cannes, he became the master that we all admire. What I like here is that sequence where the young kid is leaving his home and he turns and looks at his family, and there is a face, a look full of melancholy. He's quitting something, he's abandoning something. And it's a moment of great poetry. And even here, although it's not equally good as Tree of the Wooden Cloaks or even Il Posto, you can see all the elements of Olmi's mastery. Did you know the film before?
No.
Did you like it?
I did. I mean, I actually thought a lot about what is the this is really, we didn't prepare. What is the movie about when they take the kid to be the Dalai Lama? I can't remember which.
The Bertolucci film.
Yeah. But it reminded me of that because it has that moment of, now.
Little Buddha.
Yeah. Now you're ours.
Yeah. And although there are several spiritual elements always in Italian cinema, Olmi was always openly, spiritual, if not Catholic. And he paid for that at the beginning of his career. Again, this is a film that anticipates all its greatness, and I think it's worth reconsidering and watching.
And is the idea that in the 60s, the sort of neo-realist throwback was already seen as passé, and certainly religion was seen as passé, and yeah.
And even the idea of casting Rod Steiger was not considered cool. Although he had made a couple of years earlier with Francesco Rosi, Le mani sulla città, Hands over the city.
Yeah.
And then he would make Giù la testa with Sergio Leone. Let's go now to your third choice, which is another, I don't want to say budget, the box office disaster, but because it's a great film.
I realized actually only now, that every film that I've picked is a box office disaster that's not funny. It's okay. I'll live with it.
I have a remedy for that.
Okay, good.
So I admire Chantal Akerman, and I think Jeanne Dormian is one of the great films, and I see her style here. Okay. But to be honest, when the film was released in 2011, I think, when I read that was taken from a Joseph Conrad book, I say never in my life I would imagine Joseph Conrad and Chantal Akerman on the same line.
Yeah.
Why do you like this film?
Honestly, I think I randomly picked the Dybbuk first. Yeah. And it ends, that clip that I wanted to talk about, the messenger's carrying the woman, and here there's the woman being carried and then carrying the man. And it was the visual rhyme, sort of. Almayer's Folie is also, it's a great book. It's Conrad's first
book.
His first novel, yeah. And it concerns a Dutchman named Almayer who is in Malaysia, and he is living in this house, and he's obsessed with gold. He's going to find this gold in Malaysia. And he has married a Malay woman and has a daughter with her, Nina, is there. And his whole idea is that he is going to, who's half Malaysian, half Dutch, and his whole idea is he's going to marry her off to the British. He's going to, this is he had sent her to white schools. And then this prince comes, Dane, is this guy, and they fall in love. And I'm leaving out a lot of this, but essentially, this girl that this colonist thinks is going to be, a ticket to trading with the British, essentially leaves with this Malay prince and is among her own. And he spends his days smoking opium and losing his mind, never finding gold. So it's this amazing kind of tale of colonial tale, but to my mind, it's a great marriage story. It's a great love story, which you don't really see in Conrad again until Victory, which is toward the end of his career, and it very much rhymed with the Dybbuk in my mind of just these inheritances that come to haunt us. And the way in which our our paths of love work toward and against our conceptions of our own identities. I also think it's a really beautiful movie.
Are you familiar with the other films by Akerman?
Yeah.
Do you like?
I do, but I mean, this is very much an outlier and a stylistic outlier, and not just being in the historical setting and so on. But what I really admire about her style in general, but especially as her style as applied to this book, is that this book, especially Conrad, his first novel, it is a verbose book. There's a lot of words in it, and she really manages to distill it into these images that I don't want to say accomplish the same thing that Conrad's words do, but that in every composition that are very much aware of what effect Conrad is going for, and responds to it, but visually. And it was the idea that finding a not a visual complement to the words, but a visual interpretation of the words, even if the person watching it is not familiar with the source text, it's admirable.
There is a moment in Notre Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo when one of the protagonists looks at the sculpture and says, "Ceci tuera cela," this will kill that, meaning that the language of the sculpture have destroyed the language of the words. Do you think that now the language of images have destroyed literature and books?
No, but I do think that one thing that that this movie suggested to me, at least, is I've Conrad is a writer I'm very interested in. I'm not alone in being very interested in Conrad, but for all the Conrad I've read, and even though one of his intentions is to make you see, as he wrote in an introduction to one of his books, I didn't get the sense of, oh shit, that's what Malaysia looks like. I needed the camera to just see that strait, that isthmus, and then just that water forever and that sky forever. And so I don't know that it's replaced it, but it's made me read Conrad differently. And I think when I read Conrad, because I'm, a Jew from Atlantic City, when we get into nature descriptions, I skip to the end of the paragraph. I'm like, okay, it's stormy. Let's get to the next thing. And I think that watching this movie has slowed me down.
How do you like Apocalypse Now, which is the most famous adaptation?
I like it. Yeah, very much so. I mean, but I do think that that's a heroic Conrad. I also think, for a long time, I'll let this sit in. God, should I tell this story? Someone was on a movie call with me, and I agreed to do this thing because one needs money to live. And they said to me, we need to figure out, what we should do. Do you have any ideas? And this was sort of the very kind of peak of Me Too cancellations. And I said, the great cancellation novel is Lord Jim.
Why?
Because he cancels himself. Yeah. And so I for about 3 weeks, until people realized that I was joking, I think I was writing a Me Too Lord Jim adaptation. Thank God they realized I was just fucking with them. Yeah.
Now there is my final choice, and surprisingly, it was mildly successful. Let's watch. Of course, I wanted to pay homage to Paul Mazursky, who is quite forgotten. But if you have all adaptations, what is in common in my choices is the contrast of different emotion. This scene is also a perfect blend of irony, tragedy, sadness, melancholy, and intelligence. Did you know the film?
Yeah.
Did you like it?
Yeah. I like it a lot. Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to. I don't know. It feels so close and so far away. I don't know what ground it occupies. In the sense of.
What do you mean so close?
in the sense of, Christopher Walken's still an actor. Cafe Reggio still exists. I'm related to and know people who were alive during that time, and I've walked that street a million times. And yet, where did those people go? And so in a sense, I feel that my distance from it is very odd, and I don't. I grew up among people who would tell me about the village in those days, and my reaction was, "Good for you," and so there is a degree of resentment to people who were in, a world like that, or at least in a world that could cinematically represent itself like that.
Are you familiar with other Mazursky films?
Sure. I mean, he made the great adaptation of Enemies.
Enemies, a love story by Isaac Bashevis Singer. It's the best adaptation of a Singer story. Novel. And also An Unmarried Woman. For some reason, it's completely forgotten, but he was a very fine filmmaker, especially in the 70s.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, one of the things that I really, what I always wondered about Next Stop Greenwich Village was how much was it a depiction of a certain milieu, a certain environment, and how much of it was a sort of an advertisement or a billboard for the rest of America to see what they wanted to have there. And that, having not been, I'm sure there are people in the audience who could tell me what the answer is. But for me, it always seemed, I never knew to what degree it was wishful and consciously self-mythologizing.
Talking about the Greenwich Village, have you seen the Bob Dylan film?
Yes.
And?
Well, do I have to tell this story? A friend of my aunt went, who had a thing with Dylan, and she said, if Dylan was that attractive, I would have stayed with him. So again, maybe that's my reaction. I wasn't interested, but I went.
I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Do you think he deserved the Nobel Prize?
More than people who are going to be getting it in 10 years.
Good answer as well.
Yeah.
It's time to leave, but since we picked all sad and tragic films, I have a comic relief, a surprise for you.
Okay.
Let's watch it. Federico Fellini used to say that comedians are benefactors of mankind, and I completely agree. I think Mel Brooks is a comic genius. So these are our next guests. I look forward to having you all. This is New York, Rome, and Capri. We have also events in Milan and Venice, but next time. Thank you all. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonio, and thank you, Joshua. Before we leave, we have a very pleasant announcement to make. Yesterday it became official that there is a new director appointed at the Italian Cultural Institute in New York. As you know, we are not the only institution that does this job, and we do that as a system with other institutions, and we are delighted that they have appointed a director that we know very well and we like very much, and it's Claudio Pagliara, that is currently the bureau chief of Rai Telegiornali, of the news for Rai, the Italian national television system. Tonight he's here in that role with the cameraman, and they're doing a story on this series. But I would like to invite Claudio to come to the stage and take your applause of welcome as director of the Italian Cultural Institute. Claudio, complimenti, complimenti. Dici due parole da direttore dell'istituto la prima volta?
No, parlo da corrispondente della RAI perché ci vorranno ancora settimane. It will be not an easy. It will take, I think, a couple of months. But thank you, Stefano, for this introduction. It was amazing dialogue, as usual. So I hope that the culture in New York will flourish even more with cooperation between the different institutions that promote culture in New York. This is my goal, is to try to make Italians, together to promote the best of our culture. So thank you very much, Stefano.
Thank you.
Ci vediamo, grazie.